Welcome, everyone, to What the Force. I'm Marie-Claire Gould, your host, and with me for most of them, our Power of Myth and Symbolism episodes is Missy. Welcome back.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me, as always.
Anakin and the Orphean myths has been something that you and I have talked about for years.
Yeah.
You've written Tumblr posts about it.
Mm-hmm.
I've actually written part of an essay I was going to post on Patreon, but then I was like, actually, I kind of want to do it with you because you've also been thinking about it before I write further thoughts on it, because it is something that is so clearly apparent to both of us, and I haven't seen it posted anywhere.
I have not seen anyone else talk about this.
And it blows my mind.
Yeah. It's surprising. It's similar to our conversation about the House of Atreus. We really hadn't heard anyone talking about that before either, even though it's so extremely evident in the tale.
Anakin is a particular interesting fellow because in some ways he is actually quite controversial, depending on maybe the end of the political spectrum that you end up being on and which phase of life he happened to be in during the story.
Mm-hmm.
I am old enough to remember how much certain men looked at child Anakin being as young as he is, and how George specifically wanted to make him younger and more innocent, and how some men just couldn't even wrap their brains around that being Darth Vader.
Yeah. Well, nobody wanted him as this adorable, sweet little kid who would say things like, yippee, and stuff. Like, nobody wanted that. And it's like, but that's important to his story and to an understanding of what he represents.
And everyone starts out as a baby. Everyone starts out as a little child.
The worst people in the world start out as children who,
do not know anything about hate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, we're going to be bringing up Shmi. Don't worry.
Oh, yeah.
But this is a really important one because Orpheus as a character is actually also a repetitive motif in our story and our collective unconscious. Orpheus himself is an archetype.
Yeah, absolutely. It is how we address the question of failure and loss and unrecoverable loss. It's obviously a huge thing for a lot of people. I think it's absolutely a huge thing for mask people, for everyone, but the response to loss and the response to failure dictates a lot of our actions, and a lot of history can be traced by how people responded to that. So it's a significant thing in all of our story.
I think a lot about tragedy and failure, like you're talking about, and the best book that I've read on it has been The Theater of War by Brian Dories. And he talks about how tragedy is actually almost like a vaccine for dealing with a chaotic world, in that it allows us catharsis in a controllable fictional place emotionally to work through what we need to work through so that we are not stunned into silence by the chaos of a hard world.
And that's obviously very relevant to us at this time when we live in such a chaotic and dangerous world where there's a lot of fear. How are we going to respond to that? And that's why telling these stories can help us think, how do we respond to that? What are the potential outcomes of different responses?
And rewatching the second trilogy, the prequel trilogy, feels very apropos at this point in our history.
Yes, very much.
And so this is important. This is an important story. And yet we don't talk about it in this particular way as a culture. So let's talk about it, Missy. You and I bring in the cultural footstones or the cultural cornerstones to the people.
That's what we do.
What is this episode about, Missy? You wrote this thesis statement. I'll let you go ahead.
All right, everyone. So the beginning of this dissertation. No. What we're saying is that Star Wars draws on the classic tragedy of Orpheus to set recognizable stakes and then responds to that tragedy with a vision for healing. As the central mythopoeia of our modern culture, the story of Anakin reflects the central challenge of patriarchal masculinity. How are boys and men to show love?
I love it so much. It gave me shivers. Because this is a genuine problem that we're facing, and it hasn't not been like, it's not brand new. Let's just say this. It is not brand new. This is something that George saw when he was writing his stories. He saw it in Return of the Jedi. He saw it in writing the prequels, but specifically when he is drawing on the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker, we see it come out even more in full force.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was very personal for George.
It was, yeah.
Incredibly.
He was himself dealing with the loss of the separation from his wife, right? And the change of that relationship, becoming kind of a single dad in that situation. We've talked a lot about how Willow was very much inspired by his own experiences, or at least we think so.
I think it's very obvious. Go back and listen to so we have our episode on the Willow movie. We cover this in quite a lot of depth about George's history and how we believe, looking at the story and looking at, the available literature about his perspective and interviews with him at the time, that the story of Luke Skywalker was to some extent George's perspective as a young man and sort of his understanding of who he wanted to be as a man. And then after that, when he experienced his divorce and, had his first child and then adopted two additional children, so he suddenly then was a single dad to three kids. And so he told this story about, Willow taking on this baby girl. And so that was very personal for him in terms of who he wanted to be as a father. And then there's also a belief, and there are other biographers of George who have said as much, that the story of the prequel trilogy is the story of the loss of his bride, his wife. So Anakin sort of, bringing upon himself, even with the best of intentions, the loss of Padme, and then his fall was George to some extent coming to grips with what had happened to his marriage. So it's not a new idea that's kind of what he was working through in this story. But George has always been so deep in the mythology and the fairy tales and everything. And so even though it wasn't deliberate to our knowledge, the fact that he was drawing on this sort of quintessential tale of loss, I think is why it's so powerful.
Some people might not be as familiar with the Orphean myths. I do want to say that we are going to be talking a little bit more about the underworld, which is a big thing that I've been talking about in my Power of Myth and Symbolism episodes in the last year. I'm really obsessed with it right now to talk about the underworld. Why the underworld? Why is it important for us to understand that? And it represents our own personal unconscious and the things that we can't actively see. And also it plugs into the motifs and the archetypes of the collective unconscious. And so Anakin himself, when he is turned into Darth Vader, is stuck in the underworld. It is a walking coffin, symbolically, that he is in. He is in a death-like state and thus unmoving. And so all of his activities, when we tie to him entering the underworld, are all about when he is Vader. His Anakin story before that point is the lead up to that.
Yeah.
And when he is still not in the underworld in his journey. So just a hero, just a guy traveling about the world, like Orpheus and the Argonauts, and saving their butts regularly from temptation and all of these things. They're very, very similar. But it's important to recognize that from a motific perspective, no one is permanently a villain. Villains are just heroes stuck in the underworld.
Mm-hmm.
That's a hard one for people to wrap their heads around. And this is Star Wars and from a Joseph Campbell lens. I would say that
Mm-hmm.
there are definitely storytellers out there that do not subscribe to this particular thought structure, but
Mm-hmm.
we ourselves go through dark periods in our life, depression, or things just aren't working out well for us. And sometimes we are spiritually dead and not very kind to others. That's our villain era.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's just important to recognize that because Star Wars is fundamentally a redemptive story, that even the worst person in the story could potentially have redemption.
And
because
the
redemption
worst,
is life.
right. And the worst person in the story,
Was a baby.
well, but their story contains wisdom for us. And I think
Yes.
that's really critical. And so that's why, again, we say this Star Wars is so powerful and has made such a huge imprint on the culture, is that you're supposed to empathize with and understand to an extent even the villains.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we are invited into their perspective. We are invited to, you know, find moments of sympathy with them where we can go, I kind of get it. I get it. Like why this person turned to the dark side. We're all supposed to understand that everyone has the potential to do so. And to your point, everyone has the potential to turn back to the light. And so it is really, really important for us to be willing to go into the underworld with these characters, because that, again, is what gives us the blueprint in our actual lives when we have those moments.
Do you want to just talk briefly about some of the books that we'll be referencing, just so people, if they want to explore more, we can do that. I will be talking about bell hooks, the intersectional feminist, the will to change, men, masculinity, and love. I highly recommend everyone read this book. It is still super important for our time, and it talks a lot about patriarchal masculinity in relation to the dominator culture, and is apropos at any moment.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to reading it as well. I'm probably going to get into it for our next couple, however many, I don't know how many we'll do, but however many other.
We're going to talk about this as long as we need to.
Right. Point being, however many end up in this series, I'm definitely reading the book for those for sure.
We also both referenced mythology, Edith Hamilton's version, because she slaps. We highly recommend just, I don't know, having this on your bedside table, reading a myth. She's such a good interpreter of the myths, and no wonder it's like a high school classic.
Yeah. And just for the record, one of the things that I think she does particularly well is she acknowledges pretty openly that there are multiple versions of the myth. And so what she's always trying to do is give you either what is most common or maybe what is best known. So it's very helpful to kind of function as a primer. It doesn't give you the full breadth, but it works really well if you just need some basics.
I'm also a big fan of Theo.com, THEOI.com, and that is a large repository of Greek myths, and it has almost every version listed as a sub listing. So if you're like, why is this particular one involve bees and not bees? You can check it out and kind of get a good idea. And it's got a decent search engine using Google, so you can find a lot of good stuff in there.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. And so another one that we've actually referenced quite often on this show, and we will be doing it again today, sorry, not sorry, is In Search of the Swan Maiden, A Narrative on Folklore and Gender by Barbara Foss-Levy. We bring this one up so frequently because Lost Bride and Lost Husband tales are just a huge part of all of our stories, but particularly Star Wars. And so we really think it's an excellent primer for all of that. It really gives a good idea of world folklore as it relates to these themes. So definitely that. Also, for this conversation, I read Pandora's Jar by Natalie Haynes. It's Women in Greek Mythology. And this is where she did a bit of a deeper dive into many heroines of Greek myths, particularly ones that maybe get passed over for the masculine perspective. So she had an entire chapter on Eurydice, which I found really, really valuable for this discussion.
Absolutely. All right, let's get into Anakin. Anakin is an Orpheatic tale.
Mm-hmm. Well, question, do we need to give some basics on the Orphean myth first?
Yes, I think that maybe not everybody has seen Hadestown.
Yeah, in fairness, I mean, I wish I had seen Hadestown. I may or may not have seen some bootleg copies, but I haven't seen it in person yet.
Like popular retellings, what is your favorite?
My that's a hard one. I don't know. I mean, it probably would be Hadestown if I had seen it, I think, in
heard
person.
The soundtrack. Yeah.
Yes, I definitely have listened to the soundtrack quite a bit, and I know it's exactly right up my alley. But I think the other popular retelling that I truly, truly love is Moulin Rouge. And Baz Luhrmann was very open about this.
Luhrmann.
Yeah, when he put out Moulin Rouge, he talked about this constantly. If you watch on any of the special features, if that's a thing that you can find anymore, he talks about this constantly. It's the Orphean myth. It is, a man going into the underworld to retrieve his beloved, and he does not succeed.
Yeah.
And so that
the symbolism is all there with her having consumption. And,
absolutely.
Like the sort of being wooed by the dark master of all, the very rich person that woos her and things like that. Like it's all there.
Right.
So cool.
Exactly. Right. So I think that, that for the moment is definitely one of my favorite retellings. But I love the story in general because of the fact that even though it's so simple, it's also so flexible and you can do so much with it. And there's one of the things that we've talked about a few times is how sometimes the quest for the lost bride, of which the Orphean myth is sort of the blueprint, is a prelude to the search for the lost husband, like Beauty and the Beast, which is usually more successful. So this is kind of the key to understanding Orpheus and Eurydice, which is that most of the stories in this tale type they end in failure, they end in tragedy. He does not retrieve his lost bride. That is normally how it goes. And there's a lot of reasons it happens. There's a lot of ways it happens. But the reverse is not necessarily true. A lot of times, brides who go after their lost husbands do successfully retrieve or transform or heal them.
And it could be argued that Star Wars falls into that because of the story. So we'll get into that later on. But so cool. Hadestown I have actually seen, and I love it. And it's interesting because it ties together the Hades and Persephone myth and also the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, and talks about how Orpheus, although unsuccessful, is able to bring hope and rebirth to the world.
It's about the power of story.
Yeah.
Because he tells the story of Hades and Persephone, and that causes a renewal.
Yes. And convinces them to renew too in the story. The other fave for me personally, beyond Moulin Rouge, which is actually like a personal favorite of you, me, and Ty, and Kyle. We
have great taste.
We all love Moulin Rouge.
That's so good.
I feel like I gave Ty like one of those movie scene ones where it has every scene in the movie but like cut up into colors.
Yeah.
I think I gave that to her as a housewarming gift.
That is that's a perfect movie for that because
red.
It's the color. I was like, the color is intense in that movie.
I was like, this is such a weird gift.
It's such a cool gift.
But here you go. But Kyle and I actually found that we were really close when we both watched this with another guy. We all went as friends and we went to go see this. This is when we were friends, not together. Yep. And we both had the same opinion of Moulin Rouge, that we loved it, and we loved like the use of the modern music and like very Baz Luhrmann style and things like that. And the guy we were with, who was just a friend of ours, of course, was like, that was the worst movie I've ever seen. And I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, I can
You're like, nope.
judge you based on your taste.
Yeah. Judging you.
And okay, other than Moulin Rouge, other than Hadestown, I also want to mention Hades the video game, which
Oh, yeah.
you have the opportunity through the storyline to actually bring the couple back together. And through your actions, you heal the underworld, which part of that is to heal the relationships of what was broken upon entering it. And it's a great story.
Yeah.
Orpheus himself is gets to sing these bangers in the underworld because you guess he basically is like the radio station sort of. You can like change this. You can request different songs and things like that. And he occasionally sings you melodies, which is really fun.
I love it.
And Eurycity heals you when you go and visit her, gives you special like things. So
that's so cool.
Yeah, I love it. Hades, the video game, I've been meaning to talk about for a really long time from a story perspective and how much it ties to the mythic motifs of healing and change and transformation. But it's hard to do video. It's hard to do an episode on just a podcast episode on a video game. And it's even harder to do a video on a video game like this, a roguelite, where if you miss the capture of a particular moment, you can't get back to it. You have to replay the game.
Yep. Yeah.
Unbelievably hard to do Hades. But I will maybe write it up one day and people will have to be satisfied.
I think a lot of people would be very into that.
But then beyond that, we also have it's a British or a like English story, Sir Orfeo?
Oh, okay. So Orpheus and Eurydice was a commonly told tale throughout history, but in particular, there was an adaptation, I think it was a play, in the Middle Ages that was wildly, wildly popular. It was called Sir Orfeo. And really kind of the key thing to know about this is that it's a relatively faithful telling of Orpheus and Eurydice, except it has a happy ending. And so for a long time, this was the most popular version of the story. And Sir Orfeo is still popular today. But yeah, it's interesting to me that was kind of the tale for a good chunk of history.
Yeah, and that's what people were maybe plugging into. And so I never want to shade anybody on how they get into this myth. If Hadestown was like how you got into this myth, yes, right?
Yeah.
It's great. Okay, let's get into it. Missy, do you have a telling of it that we could?
I don't have one, but it's pretty easy to tell. So I'm gonna wing it, guys. So nobody get on my case for this. No, so Orpheus is the son of a muse and also, in some versions, Apollo.
Yeah.
So either he is a son of Apollo or Apollo takes a particular interest in him. And it is because of Apollo and the muse that he is gifted with this supernatural musical ability. He can sing, he can play, he's a poet, and he can play the lyre. And his music is so beautiful that it causes rocks and trees to weep. He can affect the natural world and create healing and growth through his music. And he falls in love with a woman named Eurydice. She is, in different versions, a dryad, which is a forest nymph, or a naiad, which is a water nymph. But in any case, she is, again, part of that natural world, so it makes sense that his music would woo her. And on their wedding day, again, different versions of the story. Sometimes she is pursued by another suitor who wants to take her by force. Other times she just happens to be out with her maidens, the other nymphs, frolicking about on her wedding day. And she is usually bitten by a viper and she dies. She goes to the underworld. Orpheus goes after her. And rather than dying himself, he actually walks to the underworld as a living person, which typically no one else does. There's only like one or two other people in all of Greek mythology that do this. And so he goes to the underworld and he plays his music for Hades, King Hades and Queen Proserpina, and begs for them to give his wife back. And they agree, but Persephone, Proserpina, gives a particular condition, which is she, Eurydice, may follow behind Orpheus, but he may not look back at her, and he may lead her out of the underworld. So he does, he leads her out, and just as they are about to reach the land of the living, he turns around to check and make sure she's still there, and she vanishes. And he loses her, and he is in mourning and horror, and, it's just lamenting everywhere. And at one point, either because he has rejected all other women or just because they're kind of sick of his moaning, he gets torn apart.
Yeah, he gets destroyed because women are sick of his sort of woe me when they realize that he caused this.
Right, exactly.
And he's pulled apart by the Maenad, which is
the Maenads,
or also known as the Bacchae, which are the women that follow around Dionysus.
Right, exactly. So he is torn asunder, torn limb from limb. There's actually a word for this. We'll come back to this. It's sparagmos, which is to be torn apart.
Yeah.
And so then his dismembered body is scattered. His head floats down the river. And again, different versions of the story, but he usually eventually the head comes to rest on an island, sometimes Lesbos. And then a couple things happen. The head might be about to be attacked and swallowed by another snake, another viper, but Apollo stops it and defends it. And then often the head prophesies, similar to other oracles of Apollo. Mm-hmm. And then in many versions of the story, he actually, after his death, returns to the underworld and then is actually reunited with Eurydice. But most versions of the story end with her loss. Mm-hmm. So that is the basics of the tale. And of course, there are many variations.
And I wonder if What the Force listeners are starting to get the feelings behind, like, where are the parallels lie. So let's talk about Orpheus being a divine child in a specialty way. So Anakin himself is special. Yep. He may or may not have a divine parent, but we primarily call to the muse as his mother. Anakin himself, born of the Force, outrageously powerful from a midichlorian perspective. There is also the things that Anakin can do, no one else can do.
Right. Yeah. So he is gifted with a supernatural ability. Yes. That impacts all the galaxy.
Exactly. And in so many ways, it's like the things that no one else could change in the Force and in the natural world, the living Force, Anakin can change, just like Orpheus.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
I got chills already.
He meets with Eurydice. Anakin meets with Padme. And in some versions of the story, he basically sings to her until she is in love with him.
Yeah. And she comes, we've talked about this before. Padme hails from Naboo, which is a forested, watery world, right? Bursting with life. She's surrounded by her handmaidens, just like Eurydice is often surrounded by the other nymphs. And Padme is pursued by again a snake, this dark suitor, right? Darth Sidious. And we've talked about this before, the idea of the demon lover. Doesn't have to be romantic in nature in order to be pursuing that feminine power. So to be clear, that's what Darth Sidious is doing with Padme. Certainly,
and it's about control. So he wants to control Padme in the Phantom Menace. He wants her to be under his control. Like, there's literally lines where capture the queen and we will control this whole thing. Right. And he utilizes Padme's power to control the Senate, to get rid of the old chancellor, to step into the role of power.
Right, but she represents the natural world, the creative power, that power of healing. She represents all of that. And so Anakin woos her
Yeah.
and then is drawn into this, what essentially becomes a contest between him and Darth Sidious to control or possess this creative power, the power of the feminine.
And Darth Sidious uses his fear of loss of her to control Anakin as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the snake killing her in those ways, right? I can show you the alternative path, or like I can show you the things that the Jedi won't teach you.
Mm-hmm.
Enables this fall and mistrust of what Anakin himself knows to be true, which is, and what Padme is trying to teach him, which is, if you just trust in our love and you just trust in what is in front of you, if you just ignore all of this other noise, we'll be fine.
Right. And so Anakin's vision of Padme's death at the beginning of Revenge of the Sith, that is, in terms of the myth structure, that is Eurydice's death, because that's the first death, and that's what causes him to descend into the underworld to try to save her. Yeah. So it's important to keep in mind that his vision of her death, to him, that's an actual death. That's a real death.
Oh, he's already walking down to the underworld, trying to figure out how to save her, making bad deals, all of that right after that.
So his fall to the dark side is his descent to the underworld. That's what that is.
Yes. That's, literally, the underworld is the dark side in Star Wars.
Right, exactly.
And through his efforts, he is expressing that he has even more power, because in some ways, denying the dark side, denying this power that exists within the dark side, doesn't necessarily make you stronger. But as soon as he starts to like consume that power, descend into the underworld, he gets more powerful until he reaches kind of this peak, which is he is in the underworld and trying to like convince Padme to come back to him and all of that. And he does lose her 3 times in canon. Yep. So do we want to talk about those 3 times? It's interesting that they've repeated the motif.
Well, are you including you're including the comics, or?
Yes, the comic and Vader Immortal. So in Revenge of the Sith, he loses her because he doesn't trust her like the myth.
Right.
He doesn't trust her. He thinks that she might be having an affair with.
Well, I kind of want to get to that.
Like, whatever.
Yeah, no, I do kind of want to get to that real quick. He breaks faith with her. So to be clear, in any Orphean myth or Quest for the Lost Bride, ultimately there is a broken taboo. The reason that the bride is lost to him is because he does, frankly, do something wrong. And it's important to keep in mind that, like, some people look at this as that seems grossly unfair. You know, he just was afraid of losing her. Yes, but again, the acting out of fear is what creates this. Yoda even says that, you know, this is what fear does. And so it's important to understand that acting out of fear and not out of faith is what causes this to happen, is what causes the loss to happen. In other tales of this type, there are things like, turning away from the bride when she is in her true form. That can cause the loss of the bride. There's also domestic violence can cause the loss of the bride. And keep in mind, Anakin does, do forced strangulation, right, on her. So he breaks that taboo as well. And so, his loss, the loss of Padme is precipitated by the classic breaking of the taboos for the Quest for the Lost Bride. It's always what the hero does.
Yeah, and that's really important, because even in our mythology and folklore, our archetypical feminine isn't cool with domestic violence.
That's right. She's just like, and that, I think that's what's really critical, is she's
like it's never been cool, guys. It literally
it's never okay. It's never okay. She's not okay with it. We, the audience, are not okay with it. The storyteller's not okay with it. It is very, very clearly expressed that, oh no, this is going to lose you your bride.
Yeah. And to come back from that is like a hard journey if it succeeds at all.
Why this holds so much wisdom, I think, for masculinity is because it's saying, hey, this is a vision of masculinity that ends in failure.
Yeah.
This domination, this aggression, this ends in failure.
Yep.
And let's then look, so then the story implies, okay, well, what is a vision for masculinity that ends in success and joy and union?
Yeah. And one of the things that bell hooks always talks about, so violence or the breaking of the taboo, same thing from a motif perspective. The problem with patriarchal masculinity, or the challenge of patriarchal masculinity, is it expects men to be violent to control their worlds.
Yep.
And
yes.
The domination of the self does not allow you to love. You cannot be a loving soul and dominate others.
Yeah. Yeah. Those two things are just not compatible.
I'm trying to find the right quote here. She says, masses of boys and men have been programmed from birth to believe that at some point they must be violent, whether psychologically or physically, to prove that they are men. This is the violent socialization that has been given to them, that this is their only way of dealing with problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
it's
so
the only acceptable way within patriarchy.
And through that, they mutilate themselves. They cut off their ability to love, ability to nurture, ability to grow, and are stuck in the underworld.
And that mutilation is, of course, very literal in Anakin's story and in the story of Orpheus. Orpheus is torn apart, sparagmos, as is Anakin. He is dismembered and, torn apart, and then, to your point, locked into this walking coffin. Yeah. Right. And then, he sort of floats down this river of life, just suffering.
Yeah. And a lot of the stories, or when we've gotten his point of view in text form, especially writing about it, he hates. That is the big thing. Like, he lives in a perpetual state of hate and suffering. It is not a fun place to be. It is not joyous. It is not even empowering. It is sad. And he is stuck in this state because he cannot escape it. He has been programmed to be this way and to only give suffering to others. But the thing that he hates the most is himself, because you cannot have hate and love exist in the same place. You cannot have violence and hate exist in the same place. If you are violent towards somebody else, you no longer love them. And then this is what happens with Padme 3 times.
Yeah.
The second is the 2015 run of Vader comic by Charles Soule, where Vader spends the entire run trying to build a castle by which he can meet her in his physical form and convince her to come back with him. And like some sort of dark archetype, Darth Momin helps him out. And he enters into, I would say, the Force. But the Force is not like literal. It's like the collective unconscious. It's all, shapes and forms and dreams. And so he sees things that he sort of expects to see. And eventually it leads him to this tower by which he tries to convince Padme to come back with him. And she ends up falling from the tower and leaving him.
Yeah. This is also the origin of the blue butterflies, for the record.
Yes. This is the origin of the blue butterflies, not the Rollo cartoon, but the Rollo cartoon made it more popular, associated with Ben Solo.
Yes.
The third iteration of this is actually the VR video game Vader Immortal, which you play a hero with a bloodline relation to the Mustafarians that live on Mustafar before it turned into a lava hell-like place. Hell, Hades,
Underworld.
Vader being stuck in the underworld. He keeps on going back there. Sure, he had other options. No, he wants to suffer in the underworld, continuously trying to bring back his bride.
Yeah.
In Vader Immortal, you find out that there was a similar situation where Lady Corvax, who was the leader of the planet, they fought off an invasion to Mustafar, and her husband, Lord Corvax, died. In an effort to rejuvenate him, she used the sort of like the Mustafarian heart of the planet, the Bright Star, and built an egg-like Aeon engine to try to return him from the underworld. Vader is able to communicate to Padme with the use of the Aeon engine and the Bright Star, and she tells him to not do what he's going to do. And the Bright Star is destroyed by the hero of the story, which you play in the VR game, and returns the energies to Mustafar, which allow it to start to heal itself. But Vader is still stuck in his own underworld.
Yep. Yeah. So it's very sad. But then I want to talk about what brings him out, right?
Yeah.
I want to talk about what brings him out, because this is where there's a little bit of a departure from the myth. And I think this is where we get into how is the culture responding to the myth? Because that's the thing, is retellings are never just, okay, I heard this story and now I'm going to do my own version. They're
Like
always a
Hadestown.
response. Right.
We tell the story. It's a sad tale. We tell the story. And it's in the hope of that maybe it'll be different next time.
And that's the thing. It's a response. It's a conversation. Every retelling is a conversation with those that have come before. And so Hadestown is saying, hey, here's the story we've told before. Why are we going to tell it again? And in the case of Anakin, why tell a story that, ends in sorrow for this character? Well, actually, it's because we're redeeming him. It's because we're going to have his son save him. We're going to make his children into his healing and his hope and his recovery. And that will be what ultimately, while they never do show to us him being reunited with Padme, it is easy for us to imply that that is what has happened after Luke has rescued him.
They could very well tell us this in future storytelling. Ahsoka season 2 could be an opportunity to do that.
Sure.
And if they do that, then they have told us that was successful.
Right. But that's what's happening there in the story. And so that brings me to this final part about the severed head floating down the river and then eventually coming to rest and prophesying. So what happens to Vader's helmet, right?
Right. Yeah.
Well, eventually his grandson
ends up
gets
in
it.
Kylo's bedroom.
Exactly. And he's sitting there talking to him, begging him, to speak. And of course, the reason he doesn't is because he's not Vader anymore.
No, he's not. And he's not there. Right. And
he's not there.
If he is being manipulated, he's being manipulated by a different snake, which is, we find out that, he has been manipulated by a different snake.
Right.
And, I think this is like, without all the pieces, why I was so obsessed with Reverse Anadella, which is the idea that there's reincarnation potentially in Star Wars, and Anakin is now Kylo and Rey is now Padme, and they have an opportunity to do a lost husband story. They didn't have to do it that way, and they could literally still show us that Padme ended up being back with Anakin now that he is healed, which would be cool. That would be great. That would tell us something about the myth in our mythopoeia and in our collective unconscious, that they view that this relationship was core to healing the collective unconscious.
Right. Absolutely. I think, and I think that's something we need too, is that what is the intended outcome, regardless of its success or failure? What is the intended outcome of A Quest for the Lost Bride? It is to recover the missing feminine. And what is so striking about Star Wars is the way that we have not seen or heard tell of Padme ever since she died. Nothing.
Where
and
is she?
So I think that, we've talked about this before, right? Bringing that back, referencing that it is important that she is recognized as still a critical part of the story, including how the story ends, quote unquote.
And it's very powerful when she shows up in comics, like even her imagery. It's very powerful when Natalie Portman decides to make reference to her on an SNL skit.
Yep.
She exists, but she is like hiding.
Absent.
She is absent. She is still there. But okay, what does this mean for the Anakins of the world? I mean, all of our masculine out there, because Anakin represents who we were, who we are. Anakin represents this masculine nature that we need to come to terms with in our stories and in our culture.
Yeah.
Everything that we needed, Shmi told us. Shmi Skywalker told us. He knows only about love. That's all he knows about.
Yeah.
He needs to return to that. He is there to protect you, to help you. Anakin, in who he was when we saw him on Naboo for the first time, is what we want or what we need men to see themselves in.
Yeah.
Before the violent world that we live in took hold.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there is a quote from In Search of the Swan Maiden that really speaks to this. Just to kind of preface, this is about, it's coming after a passage where she talks about how Orpheus and Hades are at odds because they both want to claim Eurydice. And what does that mean to have these two completely different views of masculinity, both trying to claim the feminine? So I'm going to read this real quick. From the Orpheus stories, however, emerges another possible meaning, usually submerged in the story pattern. The common features that link the antagonists who compete for the woman who, through flight or death, dwells in the otherworld may symbolize an essential split in the image of masculinity, one that parallels a significant duality in the husband's self-image. The failure in the Orpheus story suggests a concomitant failure on the part of man to find a model on which to pattern his behavior, to win, to hold, and if necessary, to regain his lost wife. In that sense, these stories also reveal the weaknesses of patriarchal culture. And so I think that what is being said here is that this struggle that we have as a culture and as individuals with modern masculinity is this dual vision. You have Orpheus, who at his core, central to who he is caring, he is creative, he is loving. That is who he is, and that is how he approaches the world and his bride. And then you have Hades, who is destructive, and dominating and aggressive and violent. And that is the vision of masculinity, which is often presented to men. And so Anakin represents this split. You have when he denies that he is Anakin anymore and that he is only Vader, he has associated himself with the underworld. He has associated himself with Hades and with this aggressive vision of masculinity. And he has to rediscover the Orpheus inside of him, who is loving and creative and caring. And he does that by being able to see his wife, Padme, in his son.
Yep.
And that's how he recovers
his missing self.
Missing feminine, is that he chooses to care, to love, to protect his son.
Yeah. And Padme's son. Like that's the key,
and
right?
Padme's son. Exactly.
And so Bell Hooks says, when men learn to affirm themselves and others, giving this soul, this loving soul care, then they are on the path to wholeness. And we talk about this, Missy, you and I, that the mythic quest is in a search to combine these disparate pieces of ourselves. So the Anakin who is Luke's father coming back, recognizing that he was this monster, but then choosing to walk down this good path and save his and Padme's son is him finally becoming whole. I talk about it a lot, about how it is an apotheosis moment where he finally is combined with his other self. So it too for Luke. They experience apotheosis together. And he is finally whole for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And he is able to do a miraculous thing, which is overthrow the darkness that is within himself, represented by Palpatine.
Mm-hmm.
Wild. Beautiful.
It's really gorgeous. It's beautiful. It really is. I love it so much. I love Star Wars, Marie Claire.
I love Star Wars, Missy. You know, and Bell Hooks talks about how living with integrity to yourself is the key to being an integrated soul, right? Integrating all of these pieces, acknowledging them and binding them into yourself and finding your whole self means you are living with integrity. You have been dark. You also have the capacity for love, and loving yourself means you can love others, but you cannot love yourself if you deny aspects of yourself.
Yeah, right. And that's why this is such an important message, not just for men, but for women, for non-binary people, for people of all genders, is that we all have these aspects of ourselves, and we're all affected by, the vision of patriarchy and the pressure to engage in a dominant culture and suppress the aspects of ourselves that are caring. And yet we know that the only path forward is care. And that's why this is such an important, a critical story for us in this moment. Yeah. In this moment is because care is the only path forward. Domination leads to nothing but destruction and loss.
Yep. And you end up being stuck as a emotionally mutilated person if violence and domination is your answer. The only way forward, the only way to grow, leave the underworld, is through love.
Yeah. So
hard facts.
Yeah. So take care of each other.
Yeah. Love each other.
Yeah.
What the world needs now is love.
It's true.
Love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of. Yeah, and in so many ways, when we tie this back to Hadestown, or we tie this back to other stories, love ends up being the answer that renews the world. And that's what it is like loving these disparate pieces of yourself and then being able to find love and not violence. So Bell Hooks talks a lot about what the caring, loving man looks like. Right. And she also says, like, this is not a quest that women can walk for men. They have to walk for themselves. But it looks a lot, not to sneak peek into our future episodes, it looks a lot like the Star Wars stories that we have been getting in the Disney era.
Well, there's been a very interesting trend in a lot of the recent shows, especially. And I think you can say that very clearly Star Wars is grappling with this vision of caring masculinity.
Yep. And so that's what we intend to talk about for the next little while. Yeah.
So stay tuned.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my goodness. Do you have any other thoughts on this?
I don't know. I'm really pleased that we got to have this conversation and, that we got to cover this. I think it's such an important thing to discuss. And I guess here's my thought. For everyone out there listening, normally we're just like, great, we hope you listen. We hope you enjoyed it. I would actually love the most vocal feedback that you can give us. So find us in all the places where we are online. I really want to hear what everyone thinks of this. Your familiarity with the Orphean myth, other places that you've seen it, what you think about this vision of masculinity, how it's relevant to your life. Just let's talk about this as a community. I think it's really important.
Because one of the things that I have found is not just witnessing or consuming the myth or consuming the story that makes it sticky in our collective unconscious, but also conversations like you and I are having, Missy, and then the conversations online, and then the conversations that you have with the person in line with you at the grocery store.
Yeah.
Help to bring it forward. You know, it's something that I have struggled with because a lot of people sort of expect me to have a lot of answers because I talk about this as like my very enthusiastic hobby. But story has the power to transform the internal, which enables the person to transform the external. The more people that are transformed by story individually, the more people can transform the external. Story doesn't change the world, people do. And story changes people.
I love it.
All right, Missy, where can people find you if they are looking for all of the things you do online?
All right. Best place to find me is still on Tumblr. I am All Girls Are Princesses. You can also find me on Blue Sky, but I like to be a little more under the radar there. So if you're already on Blue Sky, you should be able to find me via Marie Claire and the What the Force account.
WT Force?
Yeah. So I'm around. You'll find me.
I'm no longer posting on Twitter.
Yeah.
I might delete and deactivate. Eventually, I am on Blue Sky. I am on Tumblr, which seems like a still safe haven, which is nice. And occasionally post on Instagram. And of course, you can reach out directly on YouTube for these episodes. I do read all the comments, even the rude ones. So I hope you have enjoyed this episode and the journey that Missy and I are about to take you on with regards to dominator culture, how story can help us heal, and what Star Wars has already done and what we expect it to do in the future. Thank you, everyone. Cheers. Thank you for listening to What the Force. I'm Marie-Claire Gould, your host. Our music is orchestral music by Christy Carew for What the Force. You can support the show directly on Patreon at patreon.com/whattheforce. We'd like to thank all our patrons, especially those who love and are obsessed with What the Force: Adrian, Sarah Joy, Scott, John, Sophie H., In Wild Space, Minky Moo, Derek C., How Rude, Neil, Christian Luca, Carly Ann, and Scott C. Support the show by wearing the Force with our merch. Like and subscribe on YouTube or leave a 5-star review on iTunes or other pod apps. It helps people find the show. You can connect with us on Blue Sky at WT Force, What the Force Podcast on Facebook, or on our website, whattheforce.ca, or Discord. Links are in the liner notes. Feel free to reach out and start a conversation. Cheers.